Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive with us. Today, we're going to be tackling something that I know a lot of you guys struggle with, and that is the sort of ups and downs of learning English. We've got a ton of your sources here, articles, forum threads, even some linguistic research, all aimed at kind of pinpointing those common stumbling blocks that people hit, and then giving you some actual tools to try to get over them.
Yeah, it's interesting how even with all of the resources that are out there these days, so many learners, they seem to hit those similar plateaus. But the good news is that they are absolutely conquerable with the right approach.
So let's jump right in. One theme that kept coming up over and over again in these sources was this feeling of a confidence crisis. The grammar, you've got a decent vocabulary, but the fear of actually speaking just totally paralyzes you.
Yeah, and this is so common, so much so that there's actually a term for it in language acquisition. It's called language anxiety.
Yeah.
And it really comes from this idea that fluency equals perfection, right? That you're never going to make a mistake.
Which is, of course, totally unrealistic. I mean, even native speakers mess up their words and use slang and have regional dialects that other people from other places might not even understand.
Exactly. So a key shift that we need to make is reframing these mistakes as opportunities. It's kind of like if you think about a kid learning how to walk. They're going to fall down a million times,
Huh.
right? But each time they fall, they're learning how to balance a little bit better. Language is really the same way. Each time you kind of fumble with a phrase or get a tense wrong, your brain is actually learning and making adjustments.
And a lot of these sources that we have suggest some really cool ways to build that speaking confidence. Language exchange apps like Tandem or Hello Talk came up a lot.
Yeah, those are great for just finding some casual, low-pressure practice partners. But, honestly, any opportunity that you have to speak, even if it's just narrating your day out loud when you're by yourself, can be super beneficial.
There's even a study in one of these research papers that found that learners who talked to their pets in English showed improvement in their pronunciation and fluency.
Yeah. It really just speaks to the power of vocalizing the language,
Yes.
getting your mouth and your brain used to actually forming these sounds and sentences. And the more you do it, the less scary it feels.
Okay, so we're climbing out of that confidence valley, but another peak that looms large for many learners is pronunciation. And I will admit, I have butchered my fair share of English words.
Right. English pronunciation is very tricky. I mean, even for people whose native language seems close to English, it's really tough. The way that we connect sounds to letters is often totally inconsistent, and there are just these subtle nuances that can be really difficult to master.
And a few of the sources recommended apps like Elsa Spick and Youglish. Are those as good as they claim to be?
Yeah, they can be pretty effective,
Yeah.
especially for targeting specific sounds that might be difficult for people from your language background. They use this voice recognition technology, and they give you feedback on your pronunciation. It's kind of like having a digital speech coach in your pocket.
Yeah. That sounds a lot less intimidating than recording yourself and listening back, which is something I've tried before and always makes me cringe.
Right. Although, while it can be uncomfortable, self-recording can be really insightful.
Mhm.
You might be surprised by the sounds that you're actually making versus what you think you're saying. It can really help you to pinpoint areas where you need to focus.
And then, of course, there's the classic advice of immersing yourself in English media podcasts, movies, even audiobooks.
Totally. And it's not even really about actively studying. It's more about just getting your ear accustomed to the rhythm and the flow of spoken English. And pay attention to how native speakers link words together, where they're placing emphasis, and how the intonation changes the meaning.
Yeah, it's like learning a musical instrument. You wouldn't just read sheet music. You would listen to other people play to kind of get a feel for the nuances.
Exactly. And over time, those nuances are going to start to feel less foreign and more natural in your own speech.
All right, so we've tackled confidence and pronunciation. But what about that feeling of hitting a vocabulary valley? When you're stuck using the same basic words and can't express yourself with the level of detail that you'd like to.
Yeah, this is where things get interesting. Because vocabulary building isn't just about memorizing a list of words, it's about understanding how words work in different contexts, their subtle shades of meaning, and how they connect to different concepts.
A lot of the sources talked about setting realistic goals, like don't try to cram 100 new words a day, but maybe focus on 5 or 10 that are relevant to your interests or your goals.
Right, and that's key. Not all vocabulary is created equally. I mean, learning the word for photosynthesis might not be as useful in a daily conversation as expanding your vocabulary for verbs to describe different emotions or opinions.
Flashcards were also mentioned a lot, especially digital ones like Anki or Quizlet. Is that spaced repetition stuff actually effective?
It's incredibly powerful Because what it does is it takes advantage of how our brains naturally forget and relearn information. So instead of just reviewing words randomly, these apps will show you words right before you're likely to forget them, which really strengthens those memory pathways.
It's kind of like strategically reminding yourself of something right before you're about to misplace it.
Precisely. And the beauty of digital flashcards is that you can add in audio recordings, example sentences, even images, which makes it a multi-sensory experience and a lot more engaging.
Plus, we can't forget about the power of good old-fashioned reading. A lot of the forum threads that we saw, people were swearing by reading novels, news articles, even just browsing social media in English.
Right, because reading exposes you to vocabulary in its natural habitat.
Mm.
You see how words are being used in different contexts, how they relate to each other, and how they contribute to the overall meaning. And the more you read, the more those words are going to stick.
Some people even suggested keeping a vocabulary journal where you write down new words that you encounter and try to use them in your own writing.
Yeah, that's great. That's a fantastic way to really solidify your understanding and make those words your own. It's kind of like taking a plant from a greenhouse and transplanting it to your own garden. It needs that kind of nurturing to thrive.
So we've scaled confidence peak and pronunciation peak. We've made our way through vocabulary valley. But there's one more challenge that looms large in a lot of these sources, that is the dreaded grammar gorge.
Ah, yes, grammar. It can feel like this really dense forest of rules and exceptions, especially with English, borrowing bits and pieces from so many other languages over time. But here's the key shift that I think is really important. Grammar isn't about memorizing this list of isolated rules. It's about understanding the logic behind those rules and how they actually help you construct meaning.
That makes a lot of sense because sometimes I feel like I'll learn a grammar rule, but then I don't really know how to apply it in actual conversation.
Yeah, it's like having all the parts for a bicycle but not knowing how to assemble it. And so that's where tools like Grammarly or that classic book, English Grammar in Use, can be really helpful. They break down the why behind the rules so you get a much deeper understanding.
A few of the articles also talked about the importance of active learning when it comes to grammar, not just kind of passively reading about the rules, but actually using them in your own writing.
Absolutely. Writing is where you really internalize grammar. You're forced to make choices like which tense to use, how to structure a sentence, how to connect ideas. And the more you write, the more those choices just become intuitive.
So it's not just about keeping a diary, but maybe writing emails in English, commenting on forum threads, even trying your hand at some creative writing.
Exactly. Find those opportunities to apply what you're learning about grammar in a meaningful way, and don't be afraid to make mistakes. I mean, the beauty of writing is that you can always go back, revise, and see how those grammar choices that you make affect the clarity and effectiveness of what you're trying to say.
And if you're really stuck, there's always the option of getting some feedback from a teacher or a native speaker friend.
Yeah, having another set of eyes look at your writing can be so valuable. They can point out patterns of errors, offer alternative ways to express yourself, and just help you refine your understanding of all those tricky grammatical nuances that English throws at you.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground confidence, pronunciation, vocabulary, grammar, but all these sources really highlighted something that can make or break the whole learning journey: consistent practice. It's that feeling of hitting a practice plateau, like you're just not making progress because you lack the opportunities to actually use your English.
Yeah, that's a huge challenge for a lot of learners,
Yeah.
especially those who aren't living in an English-speaking environment. But the good news is that in today's world, there are more ways than ever to connect and find those opportunities.
Some of these forum threads were just bursting with suggestions. Online language exchange platforms came up again, as well as those English learning communities on social media.
Yeah, and those are fantastic for connecting with other learners from all over the world. You
Yeah.
can share resources, motivate each other. There's a real sense of camaraderie in those spaces that can be really encouraging when you're feeling stuck.
Some people also talked about joining online English conversation groups or even taking virtual classes.
Those are great options for more structured practice. You've got a teacher or a facilitator there to guide the conversation and give feedback. But even just casual interactions can be super beneficial. Things like chatting with friends online in English, watching movies with the subtitles on, even playing video games with English-speaking players.
There was this one story in a blog post that I read that really stuck with me. This woman was learning English and she decided to start ordering her coffee in English every single day, even though she was terrified at first.
It's those small acts of courage, those times when you step outside of your comfort zone that can make a really big difference. And the more you do it, the less scary it becomes and the more natural it feels to just use English in everyday situations.
It's kind of like building a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets. And then eventually, those practice opportunities stop feeling like chores and just start becoming a natural part of your life.
Exactly. It's about integrating English into your daily routine in a way that feels authentic and enjoyable. Because at the end of the day, the more you enjoy the process, the more likely you are to stick with it and actually reach those fluency goals that you set for yourself.
Yeah, it's so encouraging to think about those small steps, kind of adding up over time, like putting together a giant puzzle piece by piece. And speaking of putting things together, one thing that really struck me as we were going through all these sources was how much they emphasize this idea of personalizing your approach to learning English.
Right. It's
Yeah.
not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. What works for one person might not work for another person. And that's why it's so important to kind of experiment and find the methods and the resources that really click with your own learning style and your goals.
Yeah. One of the articles had this great analogy. They said it's like finding your own language learning recipe. You might start with some basic recipe, but then you kind of adjust the ingredients and the cooking time based on your own taste and what you have available to you.
Exactly. So maybe you're someone who thrives on structure and loves doing grammar exercises,
Yeah.
while somebody else learns best by just immersing themselves in the language, like watching movies or chatting with native speakers. The key is to be self-aware, understand your own strengths and weaknesses, and really build a learning plan that works for you.
Yeah, a lot of the forum discussions also really emphasize the importance of staying motivated, especially when you hit those inevitable plateaus and setbacks. Did any of the sources have any good advice for how to keep that language learning fire burning bright?
One thing that came up over and over again was this idea of setting really clear, achievable goals. So it's not enough to say, I want to be fluent in English. You have to break it down into smaller, more concrete steps. Like, I want to be able to hold a 5-minute conversation about my hobbies, or I want to be able to understand 80% of a news article about a topic that I'm interested in.
Right. Those
Mm.
smaller goals feel a lot less daunting. And every time you achieve one, it gives you that little boost of confidence and motivation to keep going.
And it's also helpful to find ways to make the learning process enjoyable. You know, if you absolutely hate studying grammar, maybe you can find some creative ways to practice, like through games or songs, or even making up your own silly sentences. If reading novels feels overwhelming, start with short stories or articles about topics that you're really passionate about.
Several of the sources also talked about celebrating those small wins along the way. Don't just focus on what you haven't mastered yet, but really take the time to acknowledge how far you've come and the progress you've made.
It's really easy to get caught up in this pursuit of fluency and just lose sight of all those little victories that are happening along the way. Maybe you finally nailed that tricky pronunciation sound that you've been working on,
Yeah.
or you're able to express an idea in a more nuanced way than you could before. All of those things are worth celebrating and reminding yourself that you are on the right track.
And it's those small wins that build up to that larger sense of accomplishment and make the whole journey worthwhile.
Totally. Learning English is a marathon, not a sprint. It takes patience, perseverance, and finding that joy in the process. And that's really what I hope listeners take away from this deep dive.
I couldn't agree more. So as we kind of reach the summit of our exploration today, let's leave our listeners with one final thought-provoking question to ponder. What if, instead of viewing English as a destination, we embraced it as this ongoing journey of learning and discovery?
Yeah, what new perspectives might you gain? What connections might you make? What doors might open up along the way?
That's kind of exciting to think about, right? To think about English not as an endpoint, but as this key that unlocks a whole world of possibilities.
Absolutely. So to all our listeners out there, we really encourage you to take that key step outside of your comfort zone and embark on your own unique adventure.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the world of English learning. We hope you gained some valuable insights, some renewed motivation, and maybe even a few laughs along the way.
Yeah, until next